I know people are still going to be logging on, but we'll go ahead and get started. I'm Tara Norris. I'm the president of the Nebraska Chamber Foundation, and we're really excited to launch our latest study today. The goal of the foundation is to roll out 2 to 4 studies every year. Our steering committee invests in both the studies and also identifies high priority issues that affect the state's economy. And so those are the things that we like to tackle and provide nonpartisan data so that we can hand that off to the chamber and to decision makers to really be able to make good decisions based off of that data. So thank you for being here today. We're really excited to launch our latest one, which is Nebraska's Technology and Innovation Future. And with that, also a big thanks to our foundation investors. You can find those online as well. Just to get a little ahead of us, I will send out a email with this recording, and we'll also post it on our website later after this. So if you can't stay for the entire time, you'll be able to have the recording with all the data. So with that, I'm going to pass off to the Nebraska Chamber President, Brian Sloan. Brian.
Hey, thanks, Tara. Really appreciate it, and thanks you and the Nebraska Chamber Foundation for another nonpartisan data report that's really important and timely as we look at economic development and economic opportunity in Nebraska. The title of this is a little challenging: Nebraska versus the nation, and we're not talking about football. We're talking about the competitiveness of Nebraska in the same way that every other state is thinking about competitiveness in a new environment. And what I always tell the staff here is we don't have to be perfect. We just have to do it better than 49 other states to win the battle for people and resources and capital in our state. So why is it important that Nebraska have a technology strategy, and not only a strategy, but a clear view of where we are and where we're going from a technology standpoint? This first came up in 2019 with the Blueprint Nebraska report. And the Blueprint Nebraska report was really a report aimed at what are the key strategies for Nebraska to remain competitive through 2030. And there were basically 4 key growth themes that were identified as really critical. And while Nebraska has lots of competitive advantages, there were 4 things that were really important. And one of those was truly becoming a technology state. And that's important for 2 principal reasons, and continues to be really important for 2 principal reasons. One, in a workforce short environment, and given U.S. birth rates, and frankly, the birth rates in Western countries around the world, this workforce issue is not going away anytime soon. And so as we look at 2030, 2040, we can expect, again, a lot of pressure on filling jobs and workforce in our existing industries in Nebraska or any other state. And so technology is going to have to be a gap filler for some time to come. And those states that do it better are just, their economies are going to grow at a faster rate. But the second piece is, within that context, every state is very much focused in Nebraska, absolutely needs to be focused on how do we attract people, and particularly young families and young professionals to the state of Nebraska. And in the coming generations, it's going to be more and more difficult for a state which is not branded as a technology state to win those battles in terms of attracting and retaining people. And so both that came out in the report in 2019. That has not changed. And so a technology strategy is really important. What this 2024 report that we're going to talk about does is it echoes many of those same themes from the Blueprint report and updates the data. And this is chock full of data, this report. And so it's a really good read. But it also focuses on a bigger elephant in the room, which is much of what happens in the world is not only what the data is in fact, but the truth is what's the public narrative around Nebraska's technology brand. And so one of my jobs at the chamber is to think about that every day, and that's certainly what Tech Nebraska is all about within the chamber is what is Nebraska's technology brand, and how do we develop it to be, a top 10 technology brand within the country. So behind this report is all of those things. We were very privileged to work with economic leadership on this report. And I'm going to turn this over to Kat Saunders to talk about both the data and this question of Nebraska as a technology brand, and take us through the report. And at the end of her presentation, she's happy to answer questions. I'm volunteering you, Kat, so I think you're happy to answer questions. If you, as this program goes on, if you would put your questions in the chat box at the bottom of your window, we will get to as many of those questions as we can at the end of this session. So, Kat, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. And thanks everyone for joining today. I know it's a very busy time of year, but I think this is an important time always at the start of the year to look at what's ahead and look at some of the more intentional work that you can be doing as a state to grow this industry. And I also wanted to let you all know that Skylar Casey is with me. Skylar is our lead analyst and really has spent a long time in the weeds on your data. Everything from the initial blueprint on. Skylar's very close to that, so we'll be tag teaming today. So Skylar's joining me. And I will just get us started here. A little bit about us, just for those of you who don't know us and haven't met Ted or myself or Skylar in the work that we've done in the last several months. But Economic Leadership is a small firm. We're about 8 people, founded a little over a decade ago, but we really specialize in competitiveness work. And as you can imagine, that's different for every single state, region, county, city that we work with. Everyone's dynamic is different, and we really have tried to gather a variety of skill sets that really bring together these plans that we work on with our clients. We're working in about half the states right now. We've got a little over 60 clients at the moment. We do a lot of these strategies, location analysis, a lot of leadership training, board training and communications, and trend predictions and strategies around growth. So really interesting work, and I'd encourage you to look at some of the other work that the foundation has done, because I think you'll start to see how it all kind of comes together nicely to set the tone for competitiveness in the state. And I love, Brian, how Brian mentioned economic opportunity. We're really working with our clients to use that language more often when talking about economic development. Probably many of you have been involved in reports where it's like maybe an elected official appoints a task force, or maybe there's a industry analysis. And a lot of those reports are wonderful, and they use a lot of the same data that Skylar and I use to inform our work. The difference is what we do is kind of take that and then assign almost an action plan or recommendations that leverage the data to really inform either policy change or organizational change. Some things that we will find in this work are really just the right people getting the right groups of stakeholders together to talk through some of the challenges for the industry. So as all of you listen in today, I would just encourage you to think about the role that you play in this work, because I think this is just the foundation. This is like the easy part. All of you rolling up your sleeves and getting the work done is where it gets complicated. We do this work across the board, just a sampling of our clients. So, you know, we really do know what we're doing. And I think what you're seeing a lot is with these state chamber organizations in particular, the foundations really embracing their role in creating content that is helpful and useful and productive for both elected officials and for the private sector. You know, this work is not meant to be your agenda for session where you go out and create your policy agenda over this. This work is supposed to be 3, 5, 10 years down the road, looking beyond whoever's in office that year, or looking beyond what your policy agenda might be that year. So it's really a bigger picture plan for the industry. One of the things that we've found really interesting as a team lately that we've been looking at is how much correlation there is between top performing metros and top performing states. So what's really interesting, when we look at these two together, you can see that those metros with the best performance are in the states that are performing best. And I think it's so interesting because you tend to see various campaigns or efforts or I don't know, strategic plans at local and regional levels. Those are very, very important. The difference is when you look at it as a state, you can really think about some systemic changes that affect every municipality, every county, every region. And so that's why it's important to understand that state level work is so necessary to make sure that your metros and your smaller communities are equally competitive. When we talk about competitiveness as a firm, and I like to call this the Abernathy model of place-based competitiveness, but we really look at 4 key pillars of competitiveness. And no surprise, business climate is a huge part of that. I would say years ago, a lot of competitiveness was just, do you have a good business climate and do you have the right real estate? And we all know that that's changed significantly. But taxes, regulatory, legal, elected officials, I think that, overall Nebraska performs quite well in this area. Workforce is another huge one. And this, again, across the country, you're seeing there's no change in this. This continues to be significant. And I'd say that this is a challenge. This is something that we're looking at closely for you. Innovation, which is a huge part of what we're going to talk about today for the technology industry. You want to have all of those key components of innovation in place, whether that's, what does your startup ecosystem look like? What does tech transfer look like at your universities? Well, patents generated in the state. And then there's infrastructure. Obviously, that's roads, bridges, tunnels, water, sewer. Power, obviously, a big, big topic in recent years. And then we've added housing and childcare to infrastructure. And that's another one where 10 years ago, that wasn't on the radar of people doing this type of work. That was for other people to figure out. And now housing and childcare are a critical component of maintaining competitiveness in your state. And you're starting to see more and more unlikely partners get involved. I gave the example the other day. I'm working in Connecticut right now, and a group called Voices for Children that the state chamber normally is at odds with in the legislature over policy. They have actually come together on this type of work for their state to solve the childcare issue. So you start to see some unlikely partners when you bring in housing and childcare, and I'm really motivated by some of that. And then obviously overlay is risk, and that could be weather, and unfortunately what's happening in California with the wildfires, that is in that risk component. Fiscal stability is another one. Political stability, people really like businesses and people, so both talent and businesses. Site selection consultants like to know what they're getting into will remain that way, and it's predictable and stable. And just other factors, everything from social political issues as well to weather. So that's really the way that we frame this work. So I'd encourage you to kind of think about that as we move ahead. Skylar?
Thanks, Kat. I'm going to talk a little bit about start off the conversation with some of the research that's already out there that gets a lot of play in the media, and see where Nebraska is in there, and then we'll dive into some of the research that we conducted for this. One of the big things that we've seen across the country is when we look at advanced industries, and that is tech, but that is also life sciences, advanced manufacturing. When you look at that group of kind of STEM-based industries, you see that a lot of the states that have over 10% gain, that dark green area, those are a lot of the states that are just seeing large economic and population growth already. Nebraska is in kind of the middle area there. So, like Brian said, if you're growing in tech, you're growing your economy. So that highlights kind of the importance of focusing on these industries. Next slide. And when you look at some of the big rankings that get a lot of publicity, this one, the information technology and innovation rankings. Nebraska is kind of in that lowest third of rankings, and you still have those kind of traditional tech states like the West Coast and New York, Virginia. They still are getting some of the highest rankings. But you see some other ones like New Mexico and Illinois, Utah that are starting to show up. And what we've seen is, tech is spreading out across the country from those traditional tech industries. But when you look at startups, next slide, Kat. When you look at startups and where those are still starting, you still get California, New York, Virginia, Massachusetts as the places where a lot of those most innovative starting tech companies want to be. So I think the challenge is still trying to get that innovation, that early stage innovation, into places like Nebraska. Yeah, and when you look at like the top AI companies, a lot of them are still San Francisco and stuff like that. So now I'll dive into some of the research that's been done in Nebraska, looking at defining the tech industry overall and what the data shows. So this is from the Nebraska Tech Collaborative, and the university there have done some great research on defining the tech sector and measuring it over the last couple of years. When we talk about tech, there's kind of two different groups. You have the tech industry jobs, and so that's someone who works for a tech company, and that could be any type of occupation. You could be a sales rep for Microsoft and not really do tech work, but you work for a tech company, and those are the blue jobs on this chart. The other basket, and there is some overlap here, but the other basket is the tech occupation jobs. And so those are people who do tech work regardless of the industry. So this could be someone who is doing high-level back-end tech for a bank or a retail brand or something like that. So that can be all across the economy, and that's that green band in these charts. So when we look over the last couple of years, both are doing well and growing. Tech industry jobs are growing a little bit more than tech occupation jobs over the last 5 years. But, it's a small but mighty and growing industry in Nebraska. And when we look at the types of industries that are building this tech sector in the state, you see a lot of computer programming, engineering, software. So a lot of the services side of tech is based in Nebraska. Talked with many of you about the sector. We also talked a lot about data centers. That's in that data processing and hosting bar right in the middle there. Not a ton of tech manufacturing, the semiconductors or the hardware side of things, which is a growing space and something to consider moving forward. So one of the research that we focused on was taking this data that Nebraska Tech Collaborative has done and showing kind of the impact that tech can have over the economy at large. And so the Tech Nebraska Collective, they found that 4% of all jobs in the state were from these tech industries. And when you do some high-level economic modeling, you can figure out kind of what that ripple effect of those jobs are. And that's in supply chain of, your suppliers nearby get more work and more money. And then you also have the income effects of if you have a new tech firm in an area, those workers are making high-level wages and they're spending that in your economy. So when you kind of account for all that spending, you get for one job in the tech sector, you get an additional 1.08, so about another job in the rest of the economy that's supported by that tech job. So when you do that, you get that 4%, you get the multiplier effect of another 4% for a total of 8% of the state's economy. And that just shows some of the kind of impact of the sector overall. And then a big part of this report was measuring where Nebraska is on what we call the tech infrastructure, the innovation part of what Kat was talking about earlier. How is Nebraska doing compared to other other states and where do they rank? So one of the big findings was a big area of focus and opportunity for growth is research and that innovation funding. So when you look at R&D totals, Nebraska's ranking does really well on state-funded research, but that's not a huge piece of this R&D thing. So federal, there's been a lot of funding recently in recent years to help grow kind of, like I said, that tech manufacturing side. Nebraska historically hasn't utilized as much of that funding and research. Academics kind of right there in the middle at 2022. And when you look at overall research and development, the state ranks 35th. And on the next slide, we look specifically at that business level R&D funding. So the blue bar there is the United States level funding when you account for the size of the economy. And Nebraska is the red there, ranking 34th. So this was an area where, tech, if you can get businesses in your state doing their own research, driving that innovation, they're also very likely to continue to build out in your state. So this would be something to highlight for expanding tech in the state. And when we looked at this over time, in the next chart, Kat, yeah, when you look at this over time, you see nationally, this is an increase. People of other states and the national average has been rising over years, but it's been pretty flat in Nebraska over this same time, last 2 decades. So this was definitely something we noticed that stood out in the data as a growth opportunity for the state. And another big thing, I talked to a lot of you. There's been a lot of work on early stage funding for new companies that are starting in the state. There's obviously the Business Innovation Act and Invest Nebraska doing a lot of work. And when you measure the venture capital across, when you account for the size of the economy, you see that Nebraska ranks 25th, which is pretty good. A lot of it is still highly concentrated in those, 4, dominant tech states. So it's about in the middle of the road. And when you look at how it's been growing over time, when you look at venture capital over time, next slide, Kat, you see that the level of funding has risen most years. And so I think that's definitely an encouraging sign and one that you want to continue to grow. And we'll talk later in the recommendations, but we did hear that kind of the gap was there's been a lot of energy for early stage, but maybe that middle or late stage funding is a potential growth area. And next slide. One of the things as far as, since Nebraska is not one of these traditional tech states, where are the opportunities for the state to grow? And talking with a lot of you, B2B and consumer has been a lot of the venture capital deals, but these ones on the right side of the chart were where a lot of you thought was Nebraska's best play for being a tech, a competitive tech state. And so that was things like, you have a lot of insurance companies in the state. So insurance tech was a highlight of something where Nebraska could be unique. Same thing with agriculture tech. Obviously, the state has such a traditional agriculture asset there. And so leveraging tech focused on that industry was also an opportunity for growth. Same thing with health and medical devices. You have great research coming out of your universities on life science and medical, and a lot of tech transfer assets there. So these were kind of the opportunities that could be more focused when you talk about tech, maybe focusing on these areas for the future. And I'll kick it back to Kat to talk more about the ecosystem that drives tech.
Yeah, I was delayed in flipping the slides because I was thinking about things, and I think one of the most exciting things I've seen over recent years is this desire and appetite for some of this money to get out of the coast and for the Midwest and other states, not the traditional states, to see more venture activity, at least even just relationships and visits and meetings and trying to get out of bubbles that money has traditionally been in. So I'm very inspired by that, and I think that's definitely an opportunity for the state. I think for those of us who were at the summit last year, at the end of last year, it's something that we heard a lot about from some of the successful startups. So it'll be interesting to see if we can kind of continue to amplify that network and get that network more hardened, so that we can get the eyeballs of those big venture funds from the coast, looking at Nebraska too. So obviously with a tech ecosystem, we think it's really important for you to kind of unpack all the different parts of what makes that successful. I like to kind of open up some of the focus groups that I do with, like, let me guess, everyone wants to be a biotech hub. And, it's more than that. And you think about some of the most successful ecosystems in the country, there was an intense approach and a very intentional approach to how they managed and used their resources. And so we like to kind of think about tech ecosystems and industry ecosystems in this way. Particularly for tech, obviously you need good broadband, you need pro-tech policies, and this is beyond just pro-growth or pro-economic development. This is specific things like R&D tax credits, or ways that you're empowered and enabled to innovate in this state, and whether you're penalized for that financially, or how you can use employees in various ways. Workforce, a big part of this. What is your workforce pipeline coming both out of your own institutions, but then also attracting others in? Ideas that are generated, we think about patents and things like that. Capital, we just spent a lot of time talking about. And I know one of the other things I was thinking about too when Skylar was talking was about those lower numbers on federal investment. And I know that there's traditionally been kind of a feeling of, we don't want to take federal money. And I know that there's certain reporting or strings attached to that. And, I got asked this question recently, and the way I would describe it is, yes, that's accurate. But if other states are doing it and getting ahead, it probably is something you should consider, especially if it's neighboring states or states that have similar current tech industry sectors like you do. If it's a comparable state, you probably want to think about, is there a way to bolster some of that funding from a federal level? And then your entrepreneurs, someone talked about entrepreneurs at the tech summit. It was like, this is where the innovation happens. This is where the next generation of industries is being created, is in your entrepreneurs. And when you've got entrepreneurs that are from the state, or they've been successful in the state, these are people who have the ability to really excite your entire tech ecosystem and motivate and draw attention to. And those entrepreneurs oftentimes become champions of the sector. So I would just, as you think about this, all of these items are important. And while they're all important, not one group can do all of them. So oftentimes we've seen successful tech hubs tend to assign or own various parts of this, so that some really deep work can be done in each of these areas to advance the entire tech industry overall. Just giving you, again, some benchmarks. We like to benchmark against other states, and I hope that this motivates you as well, because I don't know about you all, but I'm very competitive, and I like to see always where I am standing up against other performance factors. So we like to show you where you are when you look at all 50 states. And obviously this is an opportunity for you to rise up. I think looking at ways to, improve what's going on with tech transfer in the universities, or what's being done in the entrepreneurial ecosystem. But this is patents issued per 1,000 science and engineering workers. You're here on the lower end of this. new entrepreneurs and startups. Now, this isn't completely specific to tech, but we like this indicator as something to really guide what that entire ecosystem looks like. So some opportunity here to move up. And really and this is one that Brian and I have actually spent some time talking about, is opening rate versus closing rate. And again, not only specific to tech, but another factor that we watch to look at the health of the entire kind of innovation startup ecosystem. And I think that this goes to what Skylar was saying earlier. It's a great place to get started. There's resources, there's the bright, shiny beginning of things. And then there are some large giants in the sector that have established, well-funded, further along, good workforce. And it's that middle section of your kind of timeline here that I think we need to spend some time on. How do we make more of those companies successful? How do we make the resources? There's so many good resources that are in place. How do we get people to know more about that? We've heard people talk about how they didn't know about programs, or they didn't know they could tap into something. And I think that that's something that, to Skylar's point about building kind of that mid-stage support. And obviously workforce is a huge throttle on growth across the country. But one of the things that's really interesting is you're kind of here in the top half of people are still having children in Nebraska, where I think in the 50s and 60s, the birth rate was closer to 3.5 kids per family. And now it's, I think it's 1.7, Skylar, but it really, you've got a healthy population growth number here, looking ahead into 2034. And then looking at the change in STEM completions, obviously we know programs are in place in your educational institutions, but we'd like to see you on the positive side of this as well. And business friendliness, I mentioned this at the beginning. I like to call it out because a lot of times, sorry, it froze there for a minute. I like to call this out because a lot of times this ranking is a big battle for states that want to become tech industry hubs. And I would say that this works very much in your favor. This is from the CNBC ranking, and this is one of those rankings that people pay a lot of attention to. So positive here, you're in the top 10. So how can those business-friendly policies also support your tech industry overall? And then looking at this, we take, sometimes I kind of get almost, it falls on deaf ears almost sometimes when these rankings are coming out, right? There's a new one every day. We like to take the rankings that we feel have tremendous credibility in decision makers' minds, and we average those together and then plot them against your actual performance here. And so you'll see right here, middle of the road. So some of those states up there in the red box, you'll see have some work to do, and probably to no surprise, some of the states there you see in the green box are doing quite well, but obviously room for improvement here. And this is not so much for the purpose of the webinar today, but I like to give you this so when you see it again, you can look at all the various components that when our team does this work that we really try and dig into and understand and know where you rank, or give you an an index of where we see things moving across the country. So you can kind of see the summation of all of that right here in this slide. And just a few recommendations, and I'll just spend a little time on this, and Skylar, feel free to chime in. I know both of us have worked deeply with so many of you on the call and others throughout the state, but Just increasing that tax credit. These will be in very much more detail in the final report when you see it printed, with a little bit more background. And also something we like to do is provide you with case studies of what other states are doing, and some of the interesting programs that they've created, to inspire you to do some things differently. Really looking at in-state tech manufacturing, possibly a tax incentive for investment in new technologies, support the governor's innovation competition. You really, really need to foster that next generation of leaders. And so getting in at the beginning and supporting a competition that can get people pitching new ideas, coming up with new technologies, both in the school system and outside of that. Looking at increased federal funding and state funding for university centers, capital funding for tech companies, particularly around that middle stage, kind of filling that gap that Skylar talked about that the data supports. Promoting awareness of those resources you've already got in place. You know, some of you probably tapped into some of those, and just making sure that everybody knows about them and knows what's working. Build on the Good Life campaign. Marketing campaigns aren't everything. They don't fix a workforce problem at all, but they do complement your efforts. And so really helping those who are involved in the content for that, grow that content, particularly around tech, and telling more stories about your tech industry and what's already happening in the state. The Innovation Campus is a huge opportunity. You've got some really great large physical spaces that are coming online, and I think that's really exciting for the sector. Promoting awareness of SourceLink, as well as many other resources we talked about. Internships, great way to keep talent sticky, to keep talent in the state. And so talking about internships and obviously apprenticeships as well, but particularly keeping the college students here. Governor's Innovation Council, a lot of states have looked at models like this where they're having specific dedicated time focused on innovation. You know, it's a term that we hear everywhere, just like saying, I want to be a biotech hub. Everyone's saying we lead in innovation. You know, what does that mean? Innovation for Nebraska looks different than innovation in Ohio. So really just having a executive level group to focus in on what the state offers there. And then possibly even looking at a tech caucus where you're gathering leaders together who can really focus in on policy and legislation that will focus on the sector and the sector's growth and the health and economic well-being of the sector overall. So these are just some loose top lines. We have very, like I said, a little more detailed examples when you do see the full report, but just to give you a sneak peek at what's coming when you see the hard copy. And I think with that, I can pause. And Brian, if there's anything else, there's any other questions or something you'd like me to cover, please let us know.
Yeah, Kat, I'm going to start with a few questions. And again, for the audience, please put your questions in the chat box and I'll make sure I get those to Kat. But I've got a few things that came out of this that we can start with, which is, I mean, having grown up in Nebraska and now being a very old guy, you know, sort of the fundamental question you're first struck with is, you know, California's been a tech leader forever and ever and ever, as long as I've been in business. Is it possible to how possible is it to intentionally for a state to become a top 10 tech leader? And I think I know the answer based on, you know, let's take North Carolina and Utah. Those were two states that were not much different than Nebraska. They were primarily ag states, primarily commodity production. And then seemingly overnight, particularly in Utah's case, but also North Carolina, they became tech states. Can you give us a little more flavor around the sort of intentionality that made those states achieve their goals?
Yeah, I want Skylar to weigh in too. For those of you who don't know, Skylar actually lives in Utah. And Utah is one of the examples we use across the board with a lot of our clients. One of the stories I've told before is just building on where your strengths are. I think a lot of times states like to come in and, you know, they're going to be a tech hub and they're going to get all the bells and whistles and do all these things. And they're not thinking about their base. They're not thinking about where do they have strength in the workforce? What are their legacy sectors that possibly could transition into more of a tech, you know, that workforce could move into a tech role. And something I saw in North Carolina and Ted Abernathy and I worked in North Carolina, I'd say this was probably over 20 years ago. And I remember when NC State had this textiles program, and it was shifting that program into advanced textiles, and it ended up being wearables, and then it ended up being, you know, things that athletes could wear or people in the military could wear. And you saw this entire, you know, existing base of both innovation happening at the university, a lot of spin-off out of there, but also an existing base of people who were qualified to work in that. And so I think where you see a lot of success is people building off of areas where they've already had demonstrated success or demonstrated knowledge base. And skills training. And you know, you're seeing the evolution of this in manufacturing right now across the country, but you know, looking for areas where you can leverage where you're already strong versus scrapping it and starting all over again, you know, trying to completely change what you're supposed to be. And it sounds very simple, but we see it all over the country where people decide they're going to make medical devices and they have nothing in the entire, you know, supply chain or knowledge base or training programs to do that. And so it's finding what you've been good at or have, you know, legacy skill set in, and then taking that to have a very intentional approach to how you modernize that for what's ahead. And Skylar, maybe you want to add some things on that as well.
Sure. I have a lot of thoughts. I grew up in North Carolina and now I live in Utah. So the way I see it is the two states can kind of guide you in the two paths you want to take. I think North Carolina is a great example of that long range building. It goes back to, you know, it feels like it's an overnight success, but in North Carolina, it really goes back to the 1960s when you know, kind of the economic developers realized the textiles and the traditional manufacturing jobs were leaving, and there was a gap, and they wanted more higher wage jobs for the community. So it goes back to the creation of the research tech park, and then they really, really relied on their universities to drive innovation for a long time. And I think what we're seeing now is that payoff in that investment. Now it's the private sector is really wanting to be there, to be near that innovation. And then Utah, I think in recent years has really kind of done the short-term pivot to tech. And so it kind of shows you can do both. Utah has kind of leveraged migration trends. They have always had a high birth rate and a dedicated workforce, high participation for certain groups in the labor force. And they've been kind of able to pivot like the regional trends of people wanting to leave California. So they've been able to kind of leverage that business climate in a more quick way compared to North Carolina. So I think they've been able to do kind of the short-term pivots. So I think they're both models of how you can be doing both at the same time. And for both, they kind of paid off overnight, but it was, you know, in particularly in North Carolina's case, a really long-term vision.
Hey, Skylar, I want to follow up on that and particularly, so I was watching Utah in the categories that Kat was showing in terms of components, and Utah doesn't score super high in a bunch of those components, but where Utah scores super high is young working age population, and I get, you know, larger families in Utah, but to tell you the truth, in my earlier business career, I used to spend a lot of time in Salt Lake, and that was long before it was a hotbed for for young entrepreneurs. In fact, it was not a very attractive city for young entrepreneurs at that time, and to be candid. But overnight, and starting with the Olympics, and the infrastructure that got built around the Olympics,
Great point.
that place turned into a super place for young entrepreneurs. And some of the feedback I always get, well, we don't have mountains and lakes, or we have lots of water, I guess, but we don't have mountains and beaches. So how is Nebraska ever going to attract these young people? Well, Salt Lake wasn't the most attractive place to attract young people from California or North Carolina or anywhere else. And another city that's growing really fast close to us is Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And South Dakota ranks super high on that workforce age growth. Amazingly, and I would guess most of that is in Sioux Falls. And so you just find that correlation between the growth of Sioux Falls and the growth of South Dakota. And trust me, Sioux Falls does not have better weather than Omaha or Lincoln. So what is attracting all these young entrepreneurs right now? And I know there's probably not a ton of science, but what are you seeing?
I think the quality of life is a big part of what's happened in Salt Lake City in particular. And like you mentioned, the Olympics kind of put the city on the map, and then people realize, oh, I can be in a city and right next to the mountains and go ski. Not everybody has that. And migration's been a big part of Utah's story in growth. But I think what you said about Sioux Falls is kind of interesting. And one of the things that the data really recommended as a thing to market is, living in Utah, our home prices have just skyrocketed, particularly in the last couple of years, but even before that. And Nebraska, talking to all of you, one of the big, assets was you loved the community. It was affordable, relatively affordable place to live, great place to raise a family. And so I think there is a Midwest kind of part of the equation in the marketing and telling the story of tech of this is a place where you can start your business, you can afford a house, and you can send your kids to a great college. I think those assets and part of that Midwest equation is definitely one of the selling points of Nebraska.
Yeah, and I think that probably fits into one of the questions, which is, literally to be a top 10 tech state, you really have to be either a top 10 young population growth, young entrepreneur growth, or somewhere close along with R&D and other things. Am I wrong on that?
Kat, you want to take that one?
Well, it's not exactly that, but yes, you have to, positive population growth, and especially with workforce being, number one issue for pretty much everyone, along with energy. I will just say that energy infrastructure has really crept up there quickly as a massive driver of location decisions. But on the workforce side, if you don't have that demographic coming in, you're not going to get the eyeballs, the attention. You can't make the data look good without seeing that new population coming in. It's something really to pay attention to. And I think there's been some recent work released on the Tulsa Remote program where you've seen the growth there. I think when you think about too, the way that housing is crippling so many people across this country, looking at opportunities to talk about housing options and locations to raise a family, it's really, really important. So you've really got to show that positive growth. And again, that's regionally and statewide.
So Kat, let me take us down a different road with one of the questions here, which is startups. And you showed the opening and closing rate, and one of Nebraska's strengths for a very long time economically is if there is a culture built around value investing and capital allocation skills, that is Nebraska. We, from an investment mentality, we just have a lot of talent in this state from it. Probably less experience in terms of financing startups and financing entrepreneurs. And again, beyond that initial angel investment to getting entrepreneurs to scope and scale, and what are the risks associated with that investment, because you don't have the revenue streams, and where does this fit? What are other states and communities doing better to support that sort of venture capital as part of a capital allocation mix?
Well, I think one of the things too that I think is really important to mention for everyone is this industry, just like just like so many other things, relationships are critical in this. And I think one of the things that I saw happening at the summit, and I really am glad that I was able to be at the summit before Skylar and I finalized this work, because bringing people together and facilitating the essential conversations and life's lessons, lessons that you've learned around your journey in this ecosystem is really important. And I think that was well on display at the event at the end of last year. And so I think part of that, because your sector is smaller, your megaphone is also smaller. So getting kind of paying this all forward within the entire community is more challenging. And so I think one of the critical things that Tech Nebraska can do too is to continue to create those opportunities to share, and not only to talk about lessons learned, but also to draw that attention into other investment opportunities, and finding other ways to get investment attention through successful ventures in the state. So really magnifying those success stories and making sure that those success stories stay in the state and don't leave. I know there's been some discussion on that. So I think continuing to do that is really important. Skylar, I don't know if you want to add to that as well.
Yeah, and one thing I heard when talking with various stakeholders was that it was easier for someone starting up in Nebraska if they had some experience elsewhere and they had some networks outside of the state. And they said it was very difficult, or more difficult, for someone who was starting from Nebraska and hadn't had tech experience outside of the state. So not that you still want to have those startups, but I think there's some opportunity for some mentorship. If someone is starting up with a limited network, maybe having some pairings of someone who's had some successful companies and some mentorship that can connect kind of some of that network gap, because we're talking about Nebraska, but you still have to have connections with these other areas to grow tech. So that was one thing that came up in the interviews.
Hey, Kat, in that context, you were at the tech summit, and one of my favorite parts was, one of our trucking company CIOs talked about bringing entrepreneurs into the building and supporting independent entrepreneurs even in the building. In Nebraska, one of the strengths we have, in fact, what drew me from the East Coast back to Nebraska, was the number of Fortune 1000 companies and the number of large companies in Nebraska at scope and scale, even in ag, the number of large ag producers, and we have lots of mid-sized and large companies. This notion of, usually we think of entrepreneurs taking over a storefront in downtown and next to the coffee shop, but is this a thing of entrepreneurs actually being housed in existing large and successful companies?
You're seeing some of that. I work with a company. One of the things they say is innovation happens in person. And I think, it's very easy for people. It's easier, I should say, not very easy, but it's easier for people who are exposed to that environment and hopefully can be part of creating new technologies that are solutions for your bigger companies. Everybody is important in this. Everybody's important, from the startup to the big co. And I think that if there are opportunities to co-locate, or in the model, you see this in Cincinnati with a lot of the corporates in Cincinnati, they've created various hubs that are supported by the big companies, but it's like a innovation space or a startup hub where a community has dedicated space. But the big co's are just as invested in that space versus the Chamber of Commerce running it, right? No offense against our local economic development organizations and things like that, but having those big successful companies and people working in the R&D areas of that on site with entrepreneurs is really powerful. Houston's got another big one like this. It's called TMC3 with Texas Medical Center, where they've started co-locating companies. And I think if you can do that more and more often, it will only help your entire ecosystem. And so it's really, really, everyone plays a role in this. And I think what we've also seen with some of the challenges over the last several years in terms of supply chain, that a lot of these bigger companies are wide open to ideas to have their supply chain as close as possible, and as ease of access to these people. So if there are certain companies that you see this in Minnesota with Target, right? If you can get companies near you doing things to help solve problems within your business, more power to you. I think it's a great model, and I think we'll continue to see more of it, especially as Skylar mentioned that private investment rising in R&D activities.
Yep.
And then
Okay.
another real
Go
quick.
ahead, Doug.
Another way to think about leveraging some of your larger companies is, we talk a lot about angel investing, but I've heard kind of the concept of being an angel customer to a newer startup that's local, taking on some of that risk of being one of the first customers to a smaller upstart company is another way they can participate in the ecosystem.
Hey, Kat, we've got a few questions I'm going to take really quickly, then I've got one last question for you. The question of energy infrastructure, what's the advantages of being a public power state? Actually, the Nebraska Chamber Foundation wrote a very, very good report on this very subject. And I think that the punchline is to be competitive, we need to build as much energy infrastructure as fast as we can. And it's not one versus the other. It's everything that's on the board we've got to build. And I think there is an advantage to being a public power state in the sense that we have a concentration and we have the ability to be more nimble with fewer players to make this happen. So I do think that's a competitive advantage. There was a note on South Dakota being a zero income tax state, and was that really kind of a lot to do with this and how much of that technology is really there, or is it just from a tax standpoint it's reported there? What I will say is Nebraska is on pace to reduce its income tax to 3.9%, and that was a big piece really coming out of Blueprint, which is if you're going to build a business and presumably sell it someday, selling at a 0 or 3.9% is a lot better than California's 12.
Yes.
Utah is the same thing. Part of the Utah piece, I would assume you would agree, was the governors there made a point of reducing income taxes to a very competitive rate. And same thing happened in North Carolina, as I think about it.
Yeah.
And that was happening parallel to this. Kat, I'm going to leave you with this, and Skylar, this last question. So I grew up in little towns in Nebraska from 2,000 to 5,000 people. When we talk about tech, it's easy to think about things in Omaha and Lincoln, but is the new tech world, the new entrepreneurial world, just as viable in towns in Nebraska of 2,000 and 5,000?
I mean, we think so. We think, there is something to be said about the regional metro areas being successful. There's something to be said. You need to have airports. You need to have, larger institutions to gather the workforce and that type of thing. But given the changes over the years, we are really doing a lot of work in rural communities where we're seeing this. You mentioned the word nimble. You want to talk nimble, you can be more nimble in a smaller community. And so we are seeing that. I think that where we like to see we like to see the collaboration with that larger metro area. So continuing, understanding that you're outside of that, but also knowing it only helps you to have access to that larger metro, you know, within proximity to you. But I would say, I mean, look at Boise, Idaho, look at some of these communities that are really just coming out, and Fargo, North Dakota, places that previously, you know, didn't have that ecosystem. But I think it happens across the state. And one of the things that you can do as a tech community is, as your organization, as Tech Nebraska too, can more bring people together. And I said this before, and encourage that stakeholder engagement, encourage that discussion. It doesn't matter where you're located anymore. And especially when you're not dealing with a physical product, when you're dealing, you know, I think of some of the panelists had some really interesting technologies that it didn't matter where you were. And so that's the advantage of where we are right now in time, is being able to do that. So I think it happens statewide, but never hesitate to leverage what either state resources or regional resources offer. It only helps you.
I'll end with this. So I've spent some time in Fargo and I've spent some time in Sioux Falls. What I will say about those towns is, like Nebraska, fabulous people. Love the people in both cities. But from a weather standpoint, I never want to hear that we can't be a tech center because there's snow here.
Yeah.
One winter in Fargo will convince you. So thank you, Kat, and thank you, Skylar, for this. I highly recommend. There's a link to the report in the chat section. Make sure you take a look at that report. These reports, including the energy report, are also available on the Chamber website and the Nebraska Chamber Foundation portion of that website. And Kat and Skylar, can't thank you enough and your group enough. These reports just make a difference and help keep us focused, and you know, let's get out there. We got to do it better than 49 other states. So thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
All set? Good? Okay.
Thanks, guys.
All right, bye.